So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us here today with the WinMagic webinar, A Better Way Forward to Passwordless with MagicEndpoint. I'm your host, Lloyd Grimes, your Customer Success Manager here at WinMagic. What we're gonna do today in today's webinar is cover a number of different items, but before we get there, just a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is going to be recorded. For those who are attending, as well as those who have registered, we'll be actually sending this out so that you can go back and review it, share it with your colleagues, those within the cybersecurity space, inside and outside of your organization. So in order to keep this as interactive as possible and to address your needs, we've opened up the question and answer portion of the webinar. So you can actually feel free to send along a question and actually ask those questions throughout the webinar. If we don't answer your question during the webinar itself, we will be reaching out to you directly and making sure that you get an answer in a timely fashion. I'm actually today joined with two of my colleagues, Gary McCracken and Don Smith. Gary actually is an experienced leader in data communications and information security with more than 30 years of experience. Gary actually represents WinMagic at industry security organizations, including the Trusted Computing Group and the FIDO Alliance, as well as actually being our executive sponsor here at WinMagic for self-encrypting drives compatibility program. But he also brings a unique perspective as the security role with his dual roles as VP of Technology and our CISO here at WinMagic. Don has actually been working with us for a number of years, but has over 2 decades of experience, ranging from working with startup companies as well as large organizations. He has experience in product management, systems administration, direct client services, and sales and marketing. I'm lucky enough to work with both of them actually in a capacity where helping our customers understand their needs and being able to address that successfully here within the WinMagic product suite. Now, for today's webinar, we're actually going to be taking a look through the evolution of authentication, why traditional MFA is no longer doing the job that even today's passwordless solutions have limitations on. With that, we're actually going to dive into why that's not really supporting the zero trust and always verify strategy. We'll present a new way of thinking about authentication that is a benefit of providing the best user experience and security while future-proofing your organization's authentication strategy. Then we'll actually have both Don and Gary walk us through and take a look at MagicEndpoint, next generation authentication, the solution here with our passwordless, and that where it actually requires no user action. And with that, I'll actually turn it over to Gary McCracken to be able to get us started. Gary, as always, a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction, Lloyd. So let's start sort of at the beginning with the evolution of authentication methods to sort of set the framework or the ground here. So in the beginning, and maybe still, some just use passwords. As you know, passwords are a shared secret, something that the user knows and something that's stored in the server in some form, even if it's hashed. And they're low on the low quadrant of the security and poor user experience. What we did is we plotted them around the x-axis user experience from poor to good, and on the y-axis security from low to high. Passwords are in this poor user experience, low security quadrant. As you know, they are long and complex, hard to remember, easy to forget, and unless you use them the same one everywhere, which is bad practice, or you use a pattern, which is bad practice, and they're phishable. Essentially, it's pretty well agreed a few years ago that you need something else to make them more secure. So that's where 2FA came along. So that's adding something to traditional passwords. So you have a password plus a second factor. And that could have been an SMS text message with a one-time password, or actually a one-time password generated by an app on a phone, or a push to a phone, called that mobile push. Now, those definitely made it more secure than just passwords alone, but actually pushed the user experience further to the poor side, because you have passwords and all the same problems with those from a user experience, and you have this extra phone or token or something that you need to fumble with and manage. I'll give an example of that later on of the steps that you need to go through with this. Unfortunately, these factors of SMS, one-time password, push still aren't very secure. In the more recent years, due to some of the high-profile attacks. You might have heard of the Colonial Pipeline attack and others. In response to that, the U.S. government and others have come up with their zero trust strategies. And part of that zero trust strategy is basically requires any MFA factors to be phishing resistant. And in specific, SMS, one-time password, and push aren't phishing resistant and are basically being phased out over, well, as early as next year in terms of being an acceptable form of authentication. So in essence, the US government and others with the zero trust strategy and the hackers with their attacks have raised the bar. So now that just traditional or legacy MFA comes in the low quadrant. So it's basically pushed down to low quadrant. So poor user experience and low security, or not good enough anymore. That leaves passwordless authentication is the only type of authentication in the good quadrant from user experience and high security. And by password authentication, we mean no shared secret. It's achieved by public key cryptography. There's a private key that only the user or device has, and a public key that gets shared with the service providers or the IDPs. And a public key, if the servers are breached, it's a public key and nothing is lost because it's public anyway. But there's another tenet to zero trust strategy, and that is always verify, or continual verification. And with continual verification, even with modern passwordless authentication protocols like FIDO2 or PIV cards, smart cards, if you have to be doing re-authenticating all the time or too often, it actually pushes the user experience to the left. It starts to become a poor user experience, leaving the good quadrant of good user experience and high security empty. So what is one to do with this always verify with a high assurance authentication? Well, that's what we're here for today. And that's where WinMagic's MagicEndpoint comes in. The strength of the cryptographically based public-private key authentication, along with the no user action required for that authentication, solving both the user experience and the security at the same time. I'll explain a little bit in a while how that's possible. But before I do that, I just want to illustrate the user experience that you might have today. Some of you probably have today with legacy MFA. In this example, we have our user. He goes to connect to Office 365, let's say, with the browser, types in his password, and then he gets out his phone and authenticates to his phone, and then authenticates to his app on his phone, Authenticator app on the phone, receives a one-time password, then types that one-time password in on the screen that the app he's signing in, Office 365 in this case, and he's signed in. So quite a few steps. There's the requirement to have the phone and the app on the phone and to authenticate it to it. Not a great user experience overall, and it's still not phishing resistant. One of the biggest attacks that have become prevalent in the last 2 or 3 years, or even shorter, are man-in-the-middle attacks. And if there happened to be a man-in-the-middle attack here, they would be grabbing that password, and they'd be grabbing this one-time password and pretending to be you signing on to Office 365. So now let's take a look at the next generation MagicEndpoint, where no user authentication is required. So we still have a user, and they indicate by clicking that they want to go in Office 365. And now the endpoint performs all the remote authentication without any user action at all for the actual authentication. And that significantly makes it more secure and better user experience. Now, to do this, we have to explain a little bit of the background. We have to have some new ways of thinking in order to make this possible. Zero trust, in a way, is a new paradigm, and MagicEndpoint relies on a new way of thinking. So in this diagram, we have our end user with a computer, say a laptop with a TPM in it, a trusted platform module. and a number of different remote services they want to go to, whether it's Office 365, a VPN, or Azure, or something like that. Now, the first new way of thinking is that for remote access, we're going from the computer to these services, is that no MFA is required. And the second new way of thinking is that no user action is required. That seems almost impossible, but that's because you have to look at the third way of thinking, the new way of thinking. And that is to consider the authentication to the endpoint and separate that from the authentication of the endpoint to the remote services. And with what we have here is that the user does use MFA, does authenticate to their endpoint, and gets a high assurance authentication to the endpoint. And in the modern endpoint that almost all business class laptops have trusted platform module hardware chips in them for storing and keeping keys, takes care of the authentication from the endpoint to the service providers. And what it uses is that public key cryptography, the strongest kind of authentication required. So there is no MFA, there is no one-time password passing from this computer into the cloud. There is no, well, there's no biometrics or anything like that moving into the cloud. If there's biometrics, that all happens locally to sign on or to the computer in the first place. So again, the idea here is utilize the laptop and the strength of the endpoint, the TPM chip, and that's where MagicEndpoint can perform all these remote authentications with no user action on behalf of the user. Just before I turn over to Don, I'm going to explain what you're going to see in this architectural diagram. Because you got to remember, when you demonstrate no user action authentication, there's not much to see because there's not much you have to do. So in this first demo that Don's going to show, he's using a Windows machine, of course, with a TPM in it, and MagicEndpoint running. And in this case, we also have secure doc full disk encryption running. And he's going to use his browser to attempt to connect to Office 365. We have it configured. Office 365 is configured as part of Azure AD. So it will be redirected automatically to Azure AD. And we have MagicEndpoint configured as the authentication service for Azure AD. So what's going to happen is that when Azure AD gets the authentication request from Don, it's going to ask MagicEndpoint, and MagicEndpoint is going to go back and check directly with the computer, and it's going to verify, do an active authentication of the user, the device, and the user's intention to connect to Microsoft Office. If all three of those things are correct, and we did that high assurance cryptographic authentication passes, the MagicEndpoint gives the go ahead to Azure AD, and Don's going to get seamless access into Microsoft Office. When Don shows you this, it's just going to look like he just went in and nothing happened and there was no authentication, but there's quite a bit of authentication and intent checking going behind the scenes. The other demo that Don's going to give is he's going to give a demo of an unmanaged machine. In this case, he has a Mac. And the Mac is going to go Office 365. Azure AD is using MagicEndpoint as the authentication service. But for unmanaged machines, whether it be Mac or Linux or unmanaged Windows machines, home machines, MagicEndpoint will reach out of band to the WinMagic mobile app. And you'll see Don having to click accept to accept that. And then he'll be given access to Microsoft Office. So pretty easy, but it's not no user action in the second demo, but it covers all the bases. Next one. Well, it's time for me to turn it over to Don.
Thank you very much, Gary. I'm just going to share my screen so everyone can see this. And what we see here, if you're a current WinMagic customer, you'll recognize this. This is the pre-boot logon that we use in our full disk encryption. So for those that are not familiar with it, I'll explain what's going on here. With our full disk encryption, the hard drives are locked. Before you load the operating system, you have to unlock that, or else the operating system will not load because the disk is encrypted and locked. So in order to do that, you can log on with the username and password, unlocks the hard drive, and then you're able to, it passes control back to the BIOS, and then that loads the Windows bootloader. Windows loads up. At our pre-boot, we have different ways of securing this. It can be done with the username and password. We also support multi-factor authentication. We can use PIV cards, US government PIV cards. We can use tokens like YubiKey. We also support doing it the way that I'll be doing it here today, which is logging on with a TPM PIN. So I don't have to enter my username. I will just be entering the PIN. We also support logon if you're on the network, that if it's connected back to the SecureDoc server, that it can authenticate and log in that way, knowing that there's a user there, that they're logged in, or they're able to log in and they're connected to the network. So I'm just going to log in here with my PIN. And we have a login successful. So we'll see here in a second, Windows starting to boot up. I have this configured for single sign-on. It's an option in our full disk encryption on whether or not you have to log in separately to Windows, or if you can do single sign-on because you've authenticated at pre-boot. It makes for a very smooth user experience because my user, which is called HR1, is logging on to Windows. I didn't have to do anything else there. So I just want to show how logging on at the pre-boot gets us into Windows. As Windows is loading up here, we'll see that we're automatically logged into MagicEndpoint. Down here in the notifications, we see I'm logged on to MagicEndpoint. I don't have to log into there separately. They're configured to use the same login and key together so that we're all ready to go. And the end user, me in this case, I can do whatever it is that I want to do, which is to get to work. So I'm going to log on to Microsoft Office. So we're going to show that. What you won't see me doing is entering a username or password and having to authenticate or pick up my phone and use that to log on. So we're going to Microsoft Office. I do have to confirm my user. That's a requirement from Microsoft Office. Right now, in the background, all those lines that you saw going back and forth on the slide Gary showed are in progress. And it's already authenticated me before I could even finish saying that. Here we are logged into Microsoft Office. I didn't have to pull out my phone and enter a one-time password or select anything. I didn't have to enter my username to log on here. This all happened in the background because MagicEndpoint has taken care of that. I authenticated to the device at pre-boot using my TPM PIN. From then on, I'm logged in. I can access any of the services that we have configured to work with the MagicEndpoint. So this is how we're doing it on a Windows device. So very smooth, very clean. Now I'm going to show you how we can do that on a unmanaged device. In this case, it's going to be a Mac. Now, because I'm on a Windows machine at the moment, I've recorded this earlier, but I will show you what is going on there. As soon as I bring it up, there we go. So here on the left-hand side, we have the Safari browser opened on a Mac. I'm going to go to the same site, portal.office.com. On the right-hand side, you see I have my iPhone is mirrored to the desktop of my Mac, so that you can see the authentication prompt when it comes up. So as I said, on the left, I'm going to portal.office.com. Once it, I will have to also, again, a requirement from Office, verify what user that I'm logging on with. At this point, it's going to the back end, it's going to our identity provider. If you remember the lines from Gary's slide showing the process going on in the background, and it's going to send an authentication message here to my phone, which we now see on the screen. So it's not a one-time password. It's not a number that you have to go and enter in somewhere else. We're trying to keep this as smooth as possible, even though you do have to use your phone. I'm going to click authorize here in a second. And I do, and there we are. I'm going into Microsoft Office, just the same as I did on the Windows machine. So there's a couple of extra steps, as Gary mentioned, for out of band, because we don't have, in this particular machine, we don't have the MagicEndpoint client installed on there. But if you have an environment where you have Macs that don't have the MagicEndpoint installed and you have Windows machines, we still have a way to do it. Or if you're using a kiosk machine, this could have been done on a Windows machine. I could have done this on a Linux machine as well and use the Authenticator app that simply comes up and asks you to authorize or reject the authentication, so that you know it's you that is doing that has generated this authorization request. And that's the example of the two examples of authenticating with Microsoft Office. I'm going to turn it back over to Gary now, who will carry on.
Thanks for that demo, Don. Pretty interesting. And I'm just going to go back here. And I hope you see my screen. It says demo on it, Don.
Yes, we do.
Yes, you're up.
All right, great. All right, let's see. So I thought I had my video was on. Okay. So let's do a recap here. We saw MagicEndpoint, the easiest to use, no user action. The most secure, you saw that zero trust, always verify principle. It did do that public key cryptographic authentication in the background. And we didn't mention this before, but we got rid of those passwords. So there's and no additional hardware. You don't need certainly for the MagicEndpoint no user action one, you didn't need to have that extra phone or hardware. We're going to have a poll now. I'm going to turn that over to you, Lloyd, for the poll.
Thank you for that, Gary. So just a quick question out to the audience, just to see if your organization is actually ready to look at a proof of concept with regards to passwordless and MagicEndpoint. So with the options that are there, if we can select that, and I'll give it a couple minutes or a couple seconds there for everyone to actually click in and give an answer. We'll take that information and reach out to you as necessary, and be able to get in contact with you as an organization and you as an individual to be able to go through that proof of concept from myself, our engineers, and our product management team to be able to walk through and have that discussion. So I think from that point, Gary, we can jump through to, there we go. So looking at the feedback, some of you are immediately, some of you are a little bit further down the line with 3 to 6 months, and then 6 to 12 months out. But what we'll do is we'll have that discussion with you and reach out on an individual basis to make sure that you have the right set of information from us to be able to get started with that proof of concept. Back to you, Gary.
Hey, Lloyd, thanks. So I want to recap. You might know WinMagic for the last 20 plus years as being the leader in full encryption. We mentioned a bit, I think Don had on the Windows machine, he had secure.full encryption running. So a little bit of recap on secure.full encryption. It's FIPS certified. It's has granular key management. It is the best product on the market for encryption. Very feature rich. It has things like enterprise class pre-boot authentication, pre-boot network authentication, where we can actually use the network. Don mentioned could be PIV cards or YubiKeys for authentication, all at pre-boot. That becomes important because what that does is that gives you a very firm grasp of the hardware itself, a very high assurance authentication to the hardware even before the operating system is booted. And it's a good starting point to bring you on to MagicEndpoint. MagicEndpoint, and we didn't show it here today, but it has the option to support FIDO2 authentication to services that don't support IDP or SAML or OIDC. And it again, to recap, it's got that public key passwordless cryptography for the no user action. The endpoint authentication is done all for you with MagicEndpoint. And I think Don mentioned here, with together, we have the single sign-on for Memphis Reboot. So you can have MagicEndpoint or SecureDoc on their own or together, but they're better together because you get the protection from pre-boot all the way into the cloud. And Lloyd, did we get any questions come in? We have like 4 minutes. Do we have some time?
Yes, we have some time and we have some questions. The first one that came in actually is, do you need full disk encryption to use MagicEndpoint?
You do not need full disk encryption. MagicEndpoint can run on its own, and then the authentication that becomes most important is when you authenticate into Windows itself, and that becomes your you have your high assurance MFA authentication.
Okay. And then one that came in, and it's a simple question, what about Linux?
Linux for now is treated as an unmanaged device, so it would be the same as the demo for Mac. So yes, Linux is covered, but I also want to mention that in terms of full disk encryption, I know you didn't ask about that, but in terms of full disk encryption, SecureDoc has the only enterprise class management for Linux for full disk encryption on the market. And we're seeing Linux getting a larger and larger share of the laptop and desktop, certainly desktop market. So it's something to think about.
Okay. And then a question that came in from Ryan. What if the device gets misplaced and the TPM is authenticated?
So this is interesting. So the difference between MagicEndpoint and normal authentication is that you can you could be attempted to be hacked from anywhere in the world. The attacker could be anywhere in the world, and if he just uses your username and password or one-time password, could potentially breach. The thing with MagicEndpoint, it turns your laptop into the device, the authentication device. So the attacker would need to steal your laptop, and they would need to breach the high assurance authentication that you have to get into the laptop. And the third thing of note is, if somebody steals your laptop, you don't have your laptop anymore, and it becomes very theft evident. So you can notify your IT administrator, hey, my laptop's been lost or stolen, shut me down. Unlike normal authentication, where you could be being attacked from anywhere in the world and you wouldn't even know it. You have, you're working at home or at the office on your laptop and don't even know you're being attacked.
Fair. Okay. Ryan, I hope that answers your question. One that I get quite often as a customer success manager and speaking to clients is, you're saying that there's really nothing for the end user to do. So can you walk us through that again, just kind of that thought process and what that means?
Well, again, we've separated the authentication to the device and the device's authentication on your behalf to the remote services. So there is nothing for them to do with MagicEndpoint in terms of authentication, because when you're from the device to your remote services. But don't be worried, you still need to authenticate to that device in the first place, to your laptop, and that's where MFA does come in.
Okay. I've got a few more questions here, but I think that we'll probably only have time for one more, and then we'll have to reach out to some people individually. But then the one question that I see that's come in is, and you say this is more than secure, i.e. better security than what we have in place currently. How's that possible?
Well, first of all, we leverage that TPM, the Trusted Platform module that is in all business classes machines, and turning that device into your MFA token, the one you got to use anyway to go to your to do your work on. That's what makes it more secure. That, and the fact that the continual active cryptographic authentication is happening in the background. So it's not, those two things together make it more secure than certainly a password, and certainly more secure than traditional MFA, because MagicEndpoint is phishing resistant while those traditional factors are not. And those are that's the big attack vector now, even for one of the biggest ones for getting into ransomware even.
Fair. Okay. Thank you for that, Gary. I think the last question, and one that we've already started to touch on with the poll, is how can I book some time with a sales rep? I think we have actually the sales portal there that they can actually reach out to at sales@winmagic.com. And we can actually arrange that initial discovery. But going from that point forward, I think we're good.
Good.
All right.
Well, thank you, Lloyd, if we're done, and certainly Don, thank you.
Yep. Don, thank you very much for the demo. Gary, as always,
Well,
a pleasure to have you on the webinar. Thank you for those of you who were able to join us. And again, any questions that we weren't able to answer here live, we'll actually reach out to you directly, as well as being in contact with you with regards to an overall proof of concept for those that are requesting it for immediately. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.
Bye.